Welcome, I'm Kathleen Barnes, and with me is Dr. Jim Crawford, who is the author of A Stroke Was My Teacher, wonderful book about his own experience with stroke and his experience as a medical researcher, seeing what happened to him and having some pretty unique perspectives on stroke. So, Dr. Crawford, in the first segment, we were talking about your stroke, and you had a couple of warning strokes.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit more about then what happened, when the big one came.
Well, it was almost 2 years later. Then I go out to get the newspaper in the morning. I walk back in, I sit down, I'm reading the paper. My wife walks in, and she notices I'm sitting there holding the newspaper cockeyed, and I'm drooling, which is, of course, obviously something was wrong. She says, "Look, you've had a stroke." So it was my wife who was aware of the symptoms of stroke to the extent that she told me what my problem was. So, it was the most amazing story because we were on our way to the hospital for her surgery for that very same day on a different issue, of course. And so here I am. I know I've got to get to the hospital in a hurry, but I've also got to get her to the hospital for her surgery. So that was a real dilemma, and we had a long ways to drive. So anyway, that was a kind of difficult.
What you had two warning strokes, and then this was the third one. This was the big event.
This was the main stroke, and it had its own, as I mentioned, there was just no doubt about that one because I was drooling. I couldn't, my speech was slurred, and I had all of the traditional symptoms of stroke. But I also had some that are not traditional and are not generally recognized. One of which was the most aggravating of all the symptoms I came away with stroke, and the most difficult to deal with was neuropathy. And I had, even though I had dysfunctional side, the left side of my body, what was unusual was that I had all the symptoms of diabetic neuropathy, all of the same symptoms. I mean, I had the numbness of the leg, the foot, the arm, the shoulder, the whole bit. And yet that is not in the medical literature. But I did an entire story, research on that, and developed a very comprehensive theory on mechanisms of neuropathy and neurologic diseases. And that's found in chapter 4 of the book. And it's a totally different perspective, totally different concept of what causes neuropathy, what causes the symptoms of neurologic diseases. And it really can be quite informative for those who have an open mind. Now, I will say that it's difficult for people who have grown up in the world of stroke and heart attack and vascular diseases in general to be able to look at the results of or the observations of someone who is not a clinician, and that's really a little bit of a step to get through, because you've got to overcome that and make your case that, hey, I've got something here that's very, very important. And in my case, I was 3 years into my 2.5 years into my study of stroke when I realized, I thought, my goodness, I have nothing that I can put my finger on that accounts for my stroke. There's absolutely nothing that I can point to that would account for my stroke in terms of stroke history and stroke literature.
And so what do you think caused your stroke?
Okay. At that very moment when I was at my wit's end and I was about ready to ditch my whole study because I couldn't come up with a rational reason why I had a stroke, at that very moment I came across a book which is called "You're Not Sick, You're Thirsty." And this is written by his name is Batman. It's not really Batman. That's the Americanized version of his name. But anyways, most people recognize his name as Batman. But anyway, in this book, he reported from his clinical observations that dehydration can cause or contribute to stroke and many, many other diseases. And if you want a good eye-opening experience, get yourself this book and study it carefully, because there are at least 50 different diseases, all of which have ties to dehydration. So with that clue, then I started saying, wow, maybe that's got something to do with my stroke. And it was an eye-opening and a fantastic coincidence, if you want to call it that. I call it synchronicity. But anyway, fantastic, because the more I started looking at stroke from a dehydration point of view, the more pieces that began to fit together. And I realized that you could have numerous things that can cause red blood cells to clump together, that could form blockages to the brain or to the heart, and cause symptoms of stroke or heart attack. So when I started putting all those pieces together, then I made a comprehensive flow diagram in that book, and I showed where a lot of microorganisms can do it. I showed where elevated stress can contribute to it, because elevated stress will cause blood vessels to constrict. So if you have blood vessels that constrict, at the same time you have thickened red blood cells, then you've got the formula for what's needed to create a stroke. So you got those main factors. But then in addition to that, also I found out that magnesium deficiency can cause red cells to stick together and platelets to stick together. And so you have that element. And in fact, in my case, when I look back over my history, I can see there were warning flags 30 or 40 years before I ever had a stroke. There were warning signs out there that, had I known that they were warning signs, I would have changed my life entirely. But I didn't know they were warning, and nobody else did either. But such things as too much sugar consumption is number one, because high sugar consumption will cause your blood to thicken, and I notoriously ate way too many sweets as a teenager and in my formative years. So
and you don't have a weight problem. So.
Oh no, I certainly don't have a weight problem. If anything, I have a hard time holding my weight, because I've always been very, very physically active, and I weigh the same today as I did when I graduated from high school.
So it's a different mechanism, this insulin resistance and the sugar issue.
Absolutely different. That's the shocking part of my general thesis here about stroke, is that embolic stroke can be caused by more than one mechanism. The one that we're familiar with in the literature is the type that is related to clot formation because of plaque and the breaking of plaque and all that. But I'm saying there's an entirely second mechanism that can operate simultaneously, and that is that if you have thickened red blood cells, that can form its own category of embolic strokes. And we need to be aware of that, and I thoroughly discuss that on my website and in my literature that I released since I've written the book on that subject.
And what's your website?
www.astrokewasmyteacher.com.
Great. And we've been talking to Dr. Jim Crawford. We'll continue in the next segment about A Stroke Was My Teacher, his book, and what he's learned from having his stroke. Mm-hmm.